And you're now fairly free.
Take all the time.
Okay. Yeah. I'll give you sort of, we want to, welcome everyone. I'm Alex Juhasz, and this is the lesbian panel. And I say it jokingly, and I say it seriously. So this is the only panel with the word lesbian in it. And I talked about that with Sarah Schulman, and we were both thinking about why that was the case and what that meant in the context of the conference. And I would love for us to talk about that afterwards, the place of lesbians or lesbianism or lesbian theory or lesbian feminism within this conversation. And where it emerges, where it disappears, where it's been moved to. And we are the lesbian panel. So I think that would actually be interesting for us to think about. We have 3 out of 5 panelists here. I'm going to introduce them before they speak. And do you guys care about the order? Okay. So how about we go down the line? Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So at the far left is Joselyn Leimbach, and she's a PhD candidate in gender studies at Indiana University. Joselyn's research explores critical race and ethnic interventions in feminist and queer themes using pop culture texts. And then to her right, I have Yu-Ying. She finished her PhD in 2011 in gender studies at Indiana University of Bloomington and is a faculty member at the Graduate Institute of Gender Studies at Kaohsiung Medical University in Taiwan. Her research interests include transnational sexuality studies, transnational feminism and queer studies with a specialty on Chinese LGBT studies. In terms of her geographic location, she comes from Taiwan, which is not Thailand, China either. And if you need more information,
That's my political statement there.
that's her first political statement of many to come. Or either of you, Damien. Okay. And then we have Lilith, and her institutional affiliation is that she went to Smith College. She recently completed a master's in women's studies at Oxford and will be entering the rhetoric PhD program at Berkeley in the fall. And with no further ado, we'll begin with Jocelyn.
All right. Okay, well, thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for this wonderful experience. This presentation is a work in progress. And actually developed a new and exciting lens that I think I will explore further, but I can only hint at this presentation. So this is actually a portion of a chapter from my dissertation. So what does a reclusive criminal mastermind want with a Russian-trained killer? Angela Robinson's D.E.B.S provides an intriguing site to explore the impact of homonational ideologies on pop culture texts produced in the United States, and specifically produced for and by female same-sex desiring individuals and for audiences. Okay. At first glance, the film constructs a multicultural utopia in which issues of race and ethnicity are seemingly non-existent, therefore mirroring neoliberal claims to a colorblind society. And we can get a hint of this when we look at this poster, where there's clearly a multi-ethnic, multiracial conglomeration of women conveyed as kind of the main characters and main focus of the film. However, the film's critical engagement with the boundaries of racial and ethnic inclusion and the contingent racialization of the film's villain, Lucy Diamond, explores the limits of claims to a post-race society. Ultimately, the film's critique of neoliberal politics of race, sexuality, and gender does not extend to critically assess homonationalist rhetorics and therefore reinforcing, as Jasper Fleur says, arrangements of U.S. sexual exceptionalism explicit in relation to the nation. So marking formally excluded individuals and groups as acceptable citizens, homonationalism reinforces the idealization of the United States as a properly multicultural, heteronormative, but nonetheless gay-friendly, tolerant, and sexually liberated society. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the film D.E.B.S, I highly encourage you to go check it out. It's bad in the best way possible. D.E.B.S is named after the film's elite state-sponsored crime-fighting organization. The members of this organization are also known as D.E.B.S, and they work in teams of 4, made up of college-aged women in sexed-up Catholic schoolgirl uniforms, as you can tell, and they're all kind of individualized through their styles, but clearly meant to be a cohesive whole. So early on, Amy, the center blonde, tallest blonde, she is the film's protagonist, and early on, her team is charged with the capture of the infamous supervillain Lucy Diamond. Instead, Amy begins an affair with the antagonist, and so must deal with the consequences of these actions. So what the film does is, by positioning the 2 love interests as adversaries and placing the protagonist in as a member of a state-sponsored policing agency, the film implements camp aesthetics and shifts the fears of coming out from potential community and family exclusion to threat against the state. Sadly, this film, a cinematic gem, and its contributions have thus far been woefully underexplored, but we're going to do that today. Let's get excited about it. So the film's eventual reincorporation and acceptance of the female same-sex desiring couple reinforces Western progressive narratives, but occurs only through Diamond's atonement for her past criminal behaviors and her then conformity to naturalized modes of acceptable behavior. And this is actually also facilitated by the whitening of Diamond's racially ambiguous body. And here's a couple images from the film. This one is very early on. Clearly she's still in her criminal mode. And this is once the romantic relationship has been engaged. So you can see how the lighting actually affects the way that she might be read through racial lens. Under homonationalist logics, those marked as a threat to the nation are further marginalized from the realm of appropriate citizenry and excluded to the point of dehumanization, which ultimately justifies acts of violence by the state. The inclusion of white, upper-middle-class, cisgendered, same-sex desiring, monogamous, reproductive couples who contribute to the continuation of the nation-state via homonormative sexual performance and support of national projects such as marriage and the military affirms U.S. ideologies that emphasize the multiculturalism of the modern Western nation-state, and while also justifying the exclusion of other individuals and groups. So drawing upon this rhetoric, D.E.B.S explores the disavowal of criminality, the required sanitation of same-sex desire, and the presumed whiteness associated with state recognition. In fact, it's Diamond's same-sex desire and the required tolerance of this sexuality under homonationalism that precipitates her recognition by the state as a legitimate citizen and is expedited by conventional associations between lesbian identity and whiteness, which I will address in a little bit. D.E.B.S marks a moment when homonationalism is made visible in the realm of pop culture, but the film itself remains temporally too close and too mainstream to move beyond these homonationalist boundaries. So, Huar emphasizes the exclusion of racialized and class bodies from the increased inclusion created by homonationalism's expanding definitions of the proper U.S. citizen. Huar affirms, these dynamics are fueled by uninterrogated racial and citizenship privileges and unacknowledged racism, xenophobia, and nationalism in gay, lesbian, and queer communities and organizing. A special facet of the white liberal alibi that allows one to disaffiliate from even the remote possibility of the perpetuation of such violence. So here we're emphasizing the whiteness of the homonormative body, and Hu underscores the nationalistic assumptions that align whiteness, same-sex desire, and citizenship. Whiteness, as an uninterrogated norm, remains within this concept relatively stable, or I would argue extremely stable, within the concept, and is prioritized as a requirement for inclusion. However, I think most of us know that when it comes to questions of identity, notions of stability are problematic at best. So the instability of whiteness is actually what I'm exploring here, and both its loss and recuperation are conveyed in D.E.B.'s portrayal of the antagonist Lucy Diamond. The racial ambiguity of Diamond's body, in combination with D.E.B.'s performance of a colorblind society, creates space in which Diamond can alternately be racialized through her presumed association with criminality, and then whitened and reinserted under homonationalist logics. So Lucy Diamond herself is renowned for her violence and her theft of precious goods, hence the name Diamond. Although Lucy Diamond's real last name is discussed at the beginning of the film, is attributed as Reynolds, it's quickly bypassed and she is only referred to as Lucy Diamond for the rest of the film. So what this does is it works to disconnect the Anglo lineage of her last name, and instead aligns her with the precious jewels that she's known for stealing. So the nickname itself works to detach, works to align her with the developing countries and native peoples with which the stone is associated. The connection between Diamond and the goods she steals might for some allude to wealthy whiteness via the people who retail and consume these items, and Diamond's association with the stones via theft alludes potentially to colonizing practices in which natural resources are removed from the lands that produce them. However, given the work of dominant discourses to disassociate theft and colonial economic practices, Diamond becomes instead associated with the stones and the bodies exploited in their mining, rather than those who claim ownership. And so ultimately she's objectified and transformed into an entity that justifies state intervention. During the first interaction between the D.E.B.S and Lucy Diamond, the state-sponsored organization surveils her meeting with Ninochka Krova, who is an ex-KGB agent and now freelance assassin. So charged with gathering intelligence regarding Diamond's criminal activities, the D.E.B.S must figure out, is the title, what does a reclusive criminal mastermind want with a Russian-trained killer? And as the audience knows, the answer is a date. However, the state agency is ignorant of Diamond's same-sex desire, so instead treats the date as a meeting between two potential terrorists. So I have a scene from the film where we see both interactions and then interpretations of the interactions. Hold on, let me make sure that we have volume on this. No, not working, I'm sorry.
Is it work?
There you go. How's that right? It's mostly 3 months.
So you just basically white coin?
Sometimes maybe some more. Talking, how to get, but I do it just to be girls. Really? Mostly, I want to be dancer.
Okay, so you get a pretty good idea of the campiness of it, but you also see they're just talking about, what do you do for a living, how do you fill your time, and of course the interpretation is, I'm interested in hiring an assassin, so let's talk about business in terms of potentially engaging in criminal activities. So while the audience is aware that the conversation between Caprova and Diamond functions as the initial stages of the date, just getting to know each other, the interpretation of the interaction between the criminalized individuals is characterized quite differently by the D.E.B.S. And in fact, the D.E.B.S intrusion on Diamond and Caprova's date mimics government interventions in queer, private, and public spaces. Extending beyond the privacy of the home, LGBT activism of the 90s and continuing into today works to account for moments of public intimacy According to Lisa Dugan, the project of building an unmolested collective life required continuing remappings of a right to privacy in public and a right to publicize private matters considered offensive to the phantom general public. Diamond and Caprova's access to the public sphere, inhabited in the background, you can see mostly heterosexual couples, conveys one of privacy in public that has become available to same-sex couples. However, Huar critiques claims to universal victory in this of this concept, recognizing the ways in which government interventions in private spaces continues for those outside of idealized constructions of the citizen, and specifically those marked by their racial or ethnic othering. Diamond's access to the public sphere within the restaurant, while engaging in same-sex intimacies, is made accessible via her power as a neoliberal consumer. However, her right to privacy is denied because of her racialized criminality and the attendant government suspicion. Diamond's status as a supervillain is never questioned by the D.E.B.S, and this is due in part to her familial association with organized crime, so she inherited the crime syndicate from her father, but also her perceived criminal genius. They repeatedly say she's rumored to be behind the plot to sink Australia, which apparently never happened, but is still attributed to her as part of her genius. However, in her interactions with Amy, who is termed the only one ever to fight Lucy Diamond and live to tell about it, it's quickly revealed that she doesn't partake in most of the criminal activities attributed to her, although she does engage in an occasional theft. So here's that kind of moment of revelation. Okay, I wish you could hear this more. Can you hear the dialogue at all? Okay, so Amy's asking, why aren't you killing me? And Diamond's like, I'm not really into that. And she's like, but everyone who's ever come after you has died. And so her response is, well, one of them was in Antarctica and they died of frostbite, and one was in Peru and they died of Ebola. So I may get the claim for it, but it's not actually mine. So part of this scene is all about kind of undermining that claim to the criminality of Diamond herself. Diamond's embellished criminality and the real circumstances that led to the deaths of those attempting to apprehend her allude to contemporary debates on racial profiling and the presumed criminality of many, if not most, racialized bodies. Diamond's blithe response, I'm not into that, the assumed danger associated with Diamond, why aren't you killing me, as well as the outlandish truth regarding the agent's deaths, create an environment in which the accusations attributed to Diamond are made preposterous. The portrayal of this character as a criminal by Jordana Brewster, whose racial ambiguity is seemingly made invisible within the diegesis, gives added significance to the depictions of ethnicity and race in the film, and undermines claims to a colorblind, multicultural diegetic. Lucy Diamond's same-sex desire, in conjunction with historical constructions of lesbian sexuality, contributes to readings of this character as contingently racialized, but also white but always outside of the boundaries of appropriate whiteness. So as Siobhan Somerville notes in Queering the Color Line, the concomitant construction of modern racial and sexual categories worked to mark the homosexual body as outside the boundaries of appropriate whiteness, while simultaneously marking white individuals as the sole proprietors of same-sex desire. So effectively rendering gay men and lesbians as always already white, but never quite white enough. The shifting and contingent racialization and whitening of Lucy Diamond enacts these historical contradictions, further emphasized through her associations with criminality, which justify her exclusion from the state. Significantly, Diamond's attempts to atone for her criminal behaviors in order to recuperate Amy's trust and continue their relationship also contributes to her conditional whitening and access to recognition as a legitimate citizen. Although Diamond engages in performative norms of whiteness throughout the film, but the stigma of racialization limits the effectiveness of this shift from the racialized criminal to the almost white. And her criminal agency is exchanged for passive objectification. So whereas her criminal manifestation kidnaps Amy in order to spend time with her, her reformed iteration must wait patiently while Amy decides whether to stand up to her friends and colleagues and publicly acknowledge her affection for Diamond or dismiss her altogether. D.E.B.S engages with homonational rhetorics that seek to incorporate some appropriate same-sex desiring individuals into the rights and responsibilities associated with full citizenship. However, the film remains temporarily too close to this concept and cannot escape the neoliberal politics of national membership that requires conformity to other normative categories, specifically white middle-class mores and behaviors. While Amy is portrayed as the uber citizen, not only claiming membership within, but upholding the mandates of the juridical branch of the state, Lucy Diamond is marked as a criminal who must be punished for her trespasses against the laws of civilized society. While Diamond's conveyed whiteness and her class status would suggest that she should benefit from state protections, her presumed and real criminality, in combination with the revelation of her same-sex desire, the contingent racial categorization associated with lesbian identity, and her ambiguously raced body, work to deny her citizenship status. So Robinson's refusal to ethnically mark or racially mark Diamond's body works to employ the rhetoric of neoliberal racial politics via colorblindness, and in so doing, the limitations of this ideology are critiqued through the criminalization of the unmarked, or rather, not quite white enough body, and the attendant loss of state protections. Thank you.
Yeah, she's.
Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my presentation is Shared Conformity, Female Queer Identity Formation and Homonationalism in Transnational Taiwan. The purpose of this paper is to explore new intertwinements between queer complicity and queer resistance through my investigation of queer women's identity formation in relation to the homonationalistic discourse in the contemporary transnational Taiwan. So first of all, I'd like to first emphasize how Taiwan presents a key site to explore new forms and workings of homonationalism outside of the Euro-American contexts, mostly because of its particular lessons of national status emerging out of the political history of post-war East Asia. Moreover, in light of the criticism made by transnational feminism, this paper focuses on queer or lesbian identifying or questioning women in Taiwan. attempting to distinguish how gender served as a critical factor intervening in the ways in which homonationalism is substantiated in both terms of discourse and subjectivity formation. So, in what follows, my main arguments are listed as these 3 points. Like, I will delineate how the post-war regional politics in the East Asia gave rise to Taiwan's nationalistic imagination that concentrates on the tropes of internationalization and, in most cases, westernization. Secondly, I will show how westernized women's and LGBT movements are incorporated in this imagination of national subjectivity, while female married immigrants or working immigrants coming from China and Southeast Asia, mostly from Vietnam and Indonesia, are considered pre-modern ethnic national others. Most importantly, I demonstrate how Taiwanese queer or lesbian identifying women take advantage of this situation to develop strategic narratives and practices to negotiate conflicts between their traditional family regimes and the desire for a modern queer identity or subjectivity formation. So I'll start with a very brief history about Taiwan's pursuit of internationalized political economic modernity embedded in the post-war East Asian politics. And as you can see on the map, Taiwan is in the circle, in the little red circle there, which is while Thailand is over here. You can't even see the word Taiwan, but it's very, very tiny and small, so just for your geographic knowledge. So, okay, since its separation from China in 1949, which is right after the end of the World War II, Taiwan has experienced a gradual loss of national sovereignty due to China's ascendance in global power, along with its persistent denial of Taiwan's status as an independent nation-state in the international society. So, contextualized in the Cold War atmosphere, political conflicts between China and Taiwan also brought Taiwan into a close alliance with the United States, whose support undergirded Taiwan's political and economic development throughout the post-war era. And so, ever since then, Taiwan's international recognizability hangs on to its rapid economic growth in the 60s and 70s. So Taiwan is included in the so-called Asian Tigers, in the era of developmentalism. And Taiwan's international recognizability also hangs on to its continuous democratic reform, which is peaked at the lift of the martial law in 1989, which also becomes a cover for one of the issues of times, I think. So this westernized political economic reformation combined with the nationalistic pursuit of international recognition have significant impact on the ways in which Taiwan presents its national self, its national image internationally. On the one hand, the alliance between Taiwan and the States had led to an almost unconditional embrace of Western democratic and neoliberal values so as to distinguish Taiwan as a modern nation state as opposed to the communist China. On the other hand, the stable transformation in politics and economy enabled Taiwanese people to develop a sense of self-pride or a kind of national superiority to not only China but also to its neighboring Southeast Asian countries, which many of which has been struggling with stagnant economy, corrupt politicians, and turmoil social conditions. So, famous transnational feminist Interpol Gruwel has proposed the concept of uneven connectivities to understand complicated ways in which transnational cultural flows get to be differently received and understood and accommodated in diverse local societies. And I understand Taiwan's regional and international relations rooted in the post-war politics in East Asia is fundamental to the shaping of the uneven connectivities that Gruwel talks about for Taiwan's case. Transnational cultural influences flow through this unevenly connected network of countries has significantly determined how the majority of Taiwanese people imagine their nationalistic self among diverse transnational others. And most importantly, I argue that homonationalistic discourse in Taiwan also emerged from this unevenly connected regional and transnational network. So, the formulation of the modern gender politics in Taiwan in the recent 20 years since the 1990s up to now has elucidated how the transnational cultural politics gives rise to a gender-specific form of homonationalism in Taiwan. Since the early 1990s, the rise and proliferation of westernized women's and LGBT movements has evidenced Taiwanese government's strategy to side with liberal and progressive politics in the aspect of not only political but also socio-cultural democratization, because most of these women's and LGBT events and activities are sponsored by governments. It's also grassrooted. The government also plays a big role in its proliferation. So consequently, the women's movement promotes cultural balance of this image of a modern, independent woman free from patriarchal and traditional Chinese family regimes among the general public. And on the other side, the LGBT movement is also increasingly viewed as a symbol of Taiwan's successful liberalization and internationalization, leading to a gradual stigmatization of LGBT people in broader society, in service not like straightly in reality everybody is not oppressed, but like this is the discourse, like this liberal and optimistic for the LGBT people. And by contrast, however, cultural impacts brought by the female immigrants coming from China and Southeast Asia, as you can see mostly from the Vietnam and Indonesia, has received in a completely different way. Since the influx of the foreign female immigrants in the 1990s, social attitudes toward these women has been negative and discriminative up to now. Many Taiwanese scholars have indicated how these women are imagined as poorly educated, as uncivilized, and even as immoral, whereas their children, like many of them are married immigrants, so their children are viewed as a threat to the integrity of the Taiwanese national subjectivity in the formation. So the absolutely contrary social understandings about westernized women's and LGBT politics and the Southeast Asian and Chinese female immigrants elucidates how a homonationalistic hierarchy of gender, sexuality, and ethnicity emerged through the uneven transnational connectivity that I just described. While the westernized gender and sexual subjectivities are immediately accommodated within the nationalistic self without a doubt, the Southeast Asian and Chinese women are excluded as national others in Taiwan's imagination of internationally recognized and acknowledged national subjectivity. And the emergence of this homonationalistic discourse from Taiwan's uneven transnational connectivities has very gender-specific impacts on Taiwanese queer women's subjectivity formation, particularly in terms of allowing them to mediate the conflicts between the tensions between progressive identity politics that is brought by Western gender politics and the conservative family regimes. Studies on the emergence of modern Chinese gay and lesbian subjectivity has noticed that although LGBT movements prosper in public areas, in private relations, family, particularly the parents' expectation for the children to get married, to have their own families, remains a very strong imperative that influenced how Chinese gay and lesbians identify and practice their same-sex desires. The progressive LGBT identity politics especially symbolized by the act of coming out, is often considered very sabotaging to the balance of the family or the harmony of the family relations, which in Confucius tradition is often the foundation for a socially meaningful subjectivity to emerge. So however, the homonationalistic phenomenon provides Taiwanese queer women with the unexpected escape out of this situation without repressing or hiding their same-sex desires in family, as many predecessors of Taiwanese lesbian used to do. In my field research, a majority of lesbian or queer identifying Taiwanese women still view the balance of family relations as imperative or even compulsory, in spite of the conflicts it poses to a visible and out queer identity. Yet, intriguingly, they talk about how the contrast imagination of the Western gender and sexual subjects and the women from China and Southeast Asia allows them to avoid direct coming out and simultaneously shape a non-confrontational but still recognizable queer identity. So, for example, many of my informants talk about how they are enabled to rationalize their refusal of marriage and refusal to build a traditional family to their parents and relatives. Through this image of the modern, financially and emotionally independent women, as the mainstreaming of the westernized women's movement transformed the traditional expectation of what kind of social roles a woman is supposed to play in family and society. So as long as their strategies goes like this, as long as the parents and family get used to their unmarried status, they can gradually and strategically reveal or insinuate the knowledge of their same-sex desire by efforts like moving in with their female partners, or bring their girlfriend home for dinner, or family events, or even discussing about the popular LGBT events seen on the mainstream news media, etc. So again, I emphasize here that the accountability of these efforts and strategies significantly depends on the homonationalistic discourse that accommodates westernized women and LGBT movements as a part of this modern national subjectivity, while simultaneously expel the influx of the Chinese and Southeast Asian brides as the national others. So this discourse also critically undergirds contemporary Taiwanese queer women's desire for a sense of self-pride, and an out and proud gay and lesbian, something like that. And also the desire for social belongings, I have to be responsible for my family, I have to maintain a family balance, things like that. Insofar as they now can consider themselves and also be considered by the wider society and their family as well as integral and constitutive to the nation building project. So nonetheless, while this tendency appears to evidence how Taiwanese queer women are incorporated within, rather than critically resist this discriminative and racialized homonationalistic discourse, I do not dismiss their identification narratives and practice as entirely complicit with the norm. So, when thinking about resistant agency against homonationalism in her book Terrorist Assemblages, Poir comments that individual agency is legible only as in the tradition of humanitarianism. Individual agency is legible only as resistance to norms rather than complicity with them, thus equating resistance and agency, leading to an impossible transcendent subject who is always already conscious of the normativizing forces of power and always ready and able to subvert, to resist, or transgress them. So I'd like to point out here that Taiwanese queer women's strategies facilitated by the homonationalistic discourse, although appearing conformative to the nation's othering processes against Chinese and Southeast Asian immigrants, still create an unexpected space for them to simultaneously deal with family pressures and identify as queer in everyday practice. Therefore, I suggest this women's seeming complicity with nationalistic incorporation and traditional family imperatives suggests the possibility of alternative form of resistance and subversion against heteronormative structures for common people, for common individuals to practice in everyday life. So I also think this represents an intriguing site for further exploration of the complex relations among the transformed practices of domination and resistance under the pervasive ideologies of human rights and multiculturalism. So, okay, this is actually the topic I'm mostly concerned about, but for the sake of time, I think I have to stop here. And I'm sorry that I don't get to talk more about this because I think it's important to lay out the context first before moving on to more theoretical discussion. But I'm happy to answer questions and continue to discuss in the Q&A session. Okay, thank you for listening.
Anyone know how to get through to the bar at the bottom? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and for coming to the lesbian panel. As politically loaded as that may be. What I'd like to talk about in the next few minutes is a paper in progress and the main ideas from it. So I hope that it will be something with which you can engage. Feel free to shout back if you disagree with anything or want to challenge some ideas. Or of course, we'll have the Q&A afterwards. In the context of the recent news from the Supreme Court on discussing DOMA and Prop 8, I've chosen marriage equality as a guiding theme in looking at a possible political lesbian response reading to homonationalist pop culture. Before you smirk at political lesbian, I'd just like to say it's going to be reframed, not the 1970s version. In 1965, Edie Windsor proposed marriage to her girlfriend, Leah Spire. In 2007, over 40 years later, they were legally married in Canada. We see a slideshow of their life, the moments together, the affection, and perhaps it tugs at our heartstrings. And when we learn that 2 years after their marriage, Leah died of an illness in New York, our heart goes out to both of them. That's human empathy. New York recognized their marriage in Canada. It was legally recognized, but because of DOMA, Edie had to pay $363,000 in taxes after her partner passed away. Inheritance tax she would not have had to pay had their marriage been legally recognized. If that's not enough to get you up in arms, then, well, perhaps you're not invested in this movement. But at the same time, I'd like you to start to think about what the underlying themes are that our sentiment might not be catching. In the case for which the Supreme Court last week, 2 weeks ago, was hearing oral arguments, the main idea, the main problem was the money, was the property. It was an injustice of property, which in a way is quite fitting for a marriage debate, given the history of marriage. Who is this really going to help? How many of us would, were it not for marriage equality, have to pay $363,000 in taxes for any inheritance? Not I. And how many of us have the sort of lives that they had? Of course, it was wonderful that they got to spend over 40 years together, had a privileged life. How many of us have similar stories? And is the Supreme Court case against DOMA going to affect the queer community as a whole, or specific populations therein? For this project, I looked at Autostraddle as a representative of lesbian pop culture. Their tagline is news, entertainment, opinion, and girl-on-girl culture. Of course, I want to come back to the girl-on-girl idea a little later on. This is focusing on a behavior, not an identity. A behavior that is imbued with the biological determinism of all the gender norms that girl implies. And although they have the politics and activism tag, for which I found many of the articles that I reviewed for this project, the politics is not in the sexuality, the politics is in the news. This is an image from Autostraddle, an article on some suspicion we might have over conservative support for same-sex marriage, for marriage equality. This is Dick Cheney, if you don't recognize him. I'd be suspicious of anything Dick Cheney supports. But what I really want to point out in this image is the unified goal that Autostraddle presumes when discussing marriage equality. There's hope for everyone, they write. That presumes that marriage equality is in the best interest of their entire readership. And it's not only in this image. Throughout their articles on marriage equality, there's a presumption of unified politics surrounding marriage equality. And what I really want to focus on, a certain theme that comes across in what it means to be a progressive lesbian. What it means to be a lesbian of their readership. And this is a North American news source, but they do have readership abroad. This is a North American issue, but I think that what they're focusing on could be very specifically a North American lesbian, a beautiful lesbian, a progressive lesbian, and what does that mean? The article that questioned whether we should be wary of Republican support included this fiat. Be aware that I'm pro-marriage. You can't have an article on Autostraddle that is critical without such a line. You have to show that of course you belong to that unified goal of pro-marriage sentiment. Partly because there's a rhetoric of hate. This is Meghan McCain, if you don't recognize her in the kidnapping law. And hate was a theme you'll probably remember from Prop 8, but hate is a theme that comes up when addressing queers who don't want to buy into the marriage equality movement. They must be self-hating. And hate allows for there to be this unified goal and all other perspectives to be excluded. Ryan Conrad is one of the founders of Against Equality, which is a website that questions marriage equality. And some of their themes are themes that I'm bringing out in this paper, because what I'd like to do is make a space for critical discourse on marriage equality. A space that allows our sentiments to be respected, but our reasons, our arguments, and our politicization to come into the discourse. What can we do so that we can send our love to Edie Windsor and yet question what the underlying themes are in the marriage equality struggle. What I've reached for is this old institution of political lesbianism. And what I'd like to retain is the rejection of biological determinism that says we're not born gay, it can be a choice. We'll get to that a little later. And while the early political lesbianism has not been kind to the trans community, I think that this formulation of it is trans-inclusive and says there is not biological determinism. You do not have to be pigeonholed into binary gender. Another reason for the political lesbianism is the critical engagement with traditions, critical engagement with marriage traditions, other traditions, and then the politicization of sexuality. I'm not just girl on girl, I'm a lesbian for political means. And whether that's true for the individual speaker or not, it has a power in the rhetoric of it. And it has a power in the reading of other documents if you're approaching it from a political perspective rather than one of sentimentality. Part of the questioning of a political lesbian lens is to ask who is included in all of us. And here we come explicitly to the homonationalism. Otto Straddle has chosen this beautiful lesbian, progressive lesbian, representative of course, some lesbians. But what does she mean by all of us? Does she mean people like her, Otto Straddle readers, presumably? Who is included? Are only citizens included? Or are non-US nationals included in the us? What about single people? Are they included? How are their needs and rights served by marriage equality? Polyamorous, asexual. Also absent from the debate, I want to bring it back to the trans topic. How are trans people situated in this discourse? How do they fit into her us? And how do they fit into marriage equality as a movement? Yasmin Nair is another of the founders of Against Equality, and she picks at certain arguments from the discourse around marriage equality to address specifically this question of who is included in us. Those who are lucky to marry partners who have access to healthcare have access to healthcare. Yes, excellent. We're expanding rights in that way. But in doing so, are we also excluding a broader population from healthcare because we are privatizing healthcare? You are responsible for your partner's healthcare rather than the government is responsible for providing a human right, and healthcare is in the International Declaration of Human Rights. What about those who are not married? I think that's an important question to come back to. The last census showed that 48% of the US population, this was in 2010, indicated that they were married. That includes, I think it was roughly 10,000 same-sex couples. That's less than half the population. We are so focused on their rights, let's remember to include the entire population who may not be married. And then the born gay question. One of the issues that homonationalism addresses is the dialectics that arise, and in this charming young men. Of course, there's a certain conflation of tradition with religion. What about marriage as a tradition? And then the modern and the progressive and the cute as born gay. And what is implied by those? Some of you may remember the brouhaha a few years ago when Cynthia Nixon said, "For me, it's a choice to be with her partner." Cynthia Nixon is on the far right, her partner is in the middle, those are their children. She had to issue an apology. She had to publish an apology for saying that it was a choice. She allows this apology to include some indication that relationships are chosen. Well, I hope so. I hope they're not forced. But there's also the idea that it's inborn, it's innate, and we can't get away from this. We can't get away from the biological determinism in the homonationalist pop culture lesbian discourse that Otto Straddle represents. Recently, Jenna Wolfe came out. She came out because she was pregnant. And she said she doesn't want to bring her daughter into a world where she has to hide her partner's identity. She has to lie about who the child's other mother is. Heartwarming, yes. The article in Autostraddle focused not so much on the coming out, not on the politicization, of course, but rather on how smoking hot her partner is, and the fertility. And here we're explicitly replicating the homonationalist discourse of beautiful white women, wealthy, both TV presenters or personalities, who are going to produce the next generation. She is fertile, she is pregnant, she's been artificially inseminated. Yes, for technology. And she no longer has to swim with the sharks because now she's going to be a mom. And Autostraddle's commentary on this is, although they plan on getting married someday, their primary focus is the little human. Saccharine. But don't worry, because they're going to get married. So they're going to fit into those norms. This is no longer Autostraddle, but looking at the broader pop culture representation of lesbians and marriage equality, we have People magazine, New Yorker, and French Elle inscribing marriage equality messages in this unprovocative language with pretty white sisterhood. Look at how they're standing. Do you cuddle your girlfriend like that? One thing I don't see here is non-normative beauty. We have the beautiful progressive lesbian. Or queer kinship. Where is the room for queer kinship? And again, this comes back to the importance of looking at a political lesbian lens that allows for alternative forms of family and kinship. You don't have to wear the pretty bridal whites and sort of leave it. When women do kiss in pop culture, are those kisses? What are we doing by embracing the sentiment of marriage equality? Other than forgetting everyone for whom marriage equality is not an objective, everyone it does not help, and people it in fact harms. People who are not going to be served by the privatization through neoliberalism of all of the rights that are now granted to a wider swath of society in a still exclusionary institution. We are complicit if we do not question. And that's why I think it's important, whether you call it a political lesbian lens, whether you call it something else, to politicize your view. That sounds like I'm ordering you what to do. I think it's important for one to politicize one's view of issues, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's portrayal of lesbians in the media, whether it's the recipes on Autostraddle. There are lots of them. I guess progressive, beautiful lesbians like to cook in their Park Slope apartments. Have a visionary thinking framework that allows you to critically engage, that opens up a space for some sort of reflection of what the underlying themes are. Are the underlying themes a certain ideal of beauty? That sexuality is something biologically determined we cannot help. That there are ideal families and ideal sequences to how we establish our families. That families are specifically designed by the state. That sexuality is something you do behind doors, but is so public that the state tells us how to have our sexualities. That there are certain races to who can be a lesbian, who can be a same-sex couple, that there are certain genders to that. What are all of these underlying themes? And while we gush our love for the couples who are getting married now that they can, what are the drawbacks? What homonationalist messages, what neoliberal ideals are going into this new marriage equality? Thank you.
Great. So we're going to have lots of time for conversation, and thank you for the panelists for 3 interesting and compelling ways of thinking about gender-specific forms of homonationalism. I guess what I wanted to do really quickly before we open the floor up was ask a framing question to all three of you, something that was going through my mind as I read the papers, because of course they're really quite different, which is one of the exciting things about being put on the panel. You're looking at really different sorts of objects. You're asking perhaps similar questions through different practices in different locations. And so a through-line question that was important to me, I'm going to ask first, and then I wanted to ask each of you a question and then open the floor for conversation. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about, particularly in relationship to the three essays, so thinking, Yu-Ying? About your use of the word uneven connectivities and the importance for feminist thinking to think outside or past binaries. I was kind of consistently thinking about how binaries nevertheless end up sort of haunting the world in which you can map out the questions that you're asking. So I want to think about both the, do we always inevitably need binaries to unmake binaries? Why do we fall back in them? And where did you believe that you were making gestures that sort of pushed past binaries in the three papers? So let me just tell you some of the constructing binaries I've heard across the papers, sort of, so not uneven connectivities, but structuring and unstructuring binaries perhaps. So private and public, citizen and immigrant, biological and political, modern and pre-modern, assimilationist and radical, which seems to be haunting our conversations a lot of the panel, complicity and resistance, again, often understood as binaries, white people, people of color, Western, non-Westerns, progressive identity politics versus family connectivity. These were sort of structuring and then sort of falling away in your papers. So I'd love you to think about, the function of binary thinking in a feminist framework or in a homonationalist framework. So that's for all three of you. And then individually, Joselyn, how do you figure Angela Robinson's race in your thinking about her film? And I'm just super curious to think about, how you think that through. And also the fact that the D.E.B.S really are so, yes, I agree that there's an activity of colorblindness that you argue really well, but they are so specifically and carefully raced also in that framing picture that you show. I mean, it's such a gesture, and I think Angela Robinson is making it from a very politicized place as a woman of color, to have her leads be multiracial. So I'd love you to hear you talk about that. Yu-Ying? Oh, I'm sorry. I just feel like, I said I'd be embarrassed every time. I want to know about immigrant women who are lesbians or queer, and if you've talked with them and what their experience is, as well as just sort of want to hear that part of the configuration in Taiwan. And for you, I think that one of the things that's always, so here's another binary mainstream alternative, right? So of course when we look to mainstream culture, if we're radical people, we will be disappointed. And we need to do that to understand the broader framework in which our work occurs. But where do you find the images that sustain you? Where is the culture, where is that culture being produced? What do those images look like? I'd love to hear you talk some more about that now that we've seen you crying, you're weeping. But we saw Ryan Conrad's work there, so I want to think about the function of alternative culture in producing the images that we need, and what those images might look like. So, any of you, all of you, however you'd like to engage with me, that would be great, and then we'll open the floor. And thank you.
Okay, I'm going to address your question of color blindness in the film first, because I still need to think about the function of binaries. And maybe I'll hear something that will trigger a little bit more depth to my thinking right now. I explored the function of color blindness in the film a little bit, and my read is that she creates a shallow image of color blindness, but at the same time uses various expectations based on race and ethnicity in order to flip them on their heads. So the Asian character that you saw on the poster actually has a very deep French accent and behaves in highly stereotypical French ways. And so I think, and I would like to go into this in more depth, but I don't necessarily have that all on me. But I think what she tries to do is both play out what it might look like, but recognize that it's not something that does exist, and those histories and the expectations associated with race and ethnicity as it currently exists can never move past it in the manner that we're trying to do it, or in the manner that neoliberal racial politics are attempting to employ without addressing inequalities and the perpetuation of certain expectations associated with race and ethnicity. So, in terms of, you asked where I think Angela Robinson's race plays a part in this. I think it's extremely important. I think this film originally started as a short that was almost completely independent, really gained notoriety in a package of lesbian short films, and then was picked up along the film circuit and was turned into the full feature-length film, and is basically financed by Sony. So in a lot of ways that transition, I think, forced some of her critique to go underground, or at least be, I would say, subversive in that it's not quite as explicitly expressed. But she clearly is invested in changing the way that people think about, what does female same-sex desire look like? Well, maybe not exactly what does it look like, not visually. But how can it be expressed or experienced, perhaps?
Immigrants who are lesbians, I would say, in terms of the general imaginations, they don't exist at all. Because I think, sort of addressing your question about the binary thinking, there is this binary thinking going on. All these foreign women, they come to Taiwan for marrying a Taiwanese man in order to get a sort of the mobility, economic mobility, like this as an upward marriage. So this is the stereotypes Taiwanese public for these foreign women. I will say, most of the foreign women, they can interact with on a daily basis are all these marriage immigrants who marry to their brothers or neighbors, things like that. So, immigrants who are lesbians, it's out of imagination for the Taiwanese general public. But interestingly, there is a non-governmental association called the Taiwan Taiwanese International Workers Association who provokes or do advocation for the international workers. I would say they accidentally found out like there is a group of lesbians who are also immigrants working in the factories. So this they filmed them, and this is a documentary. They produce a documentary right now, but I'm not sure if that's in English or what. But there is 2 episodes of that. This documentary portrays how these immigrant women they work in the factory together and living in the dorms and sort of grow this sense and affections with each other and partner with each other, and they actually follow a very traditional gender roles like butch femme pairing. So I think this is a very interesting question. Like the following episodes, of this previous, this film is called People Factory. People Factory is in English. You might check it out. This year they produced a following episode following on these women what happened to them after they left Taiwan and after they left the factories they originally grew out this affectionate relationship together, and they probably not too surprisingly find out that the most of the femme lesbian get married when they return to their home country, and the T lesbians became like so heartbroken, like solitary. Like this is all very not unusual things for you to imagine. So I think this is actually a very interesting site, but that is for Alex's question I've never thought about, and I just wrote it down just now. So I think this is a very interesting site for us to think about how sexuality or sexual acts, practice, identities, subjective deformations got to be transformed or changed or reshaped in this movement, like this transnational movement. If like there is a bunch of literature, ethnographic literature, talking about how women's sense of motherhood, of being a wife, get to be reshaped or restructured when these women have to work outside of their countries, and they are no longer get to be with their husbands. They are no longer get to take care of their children, how their sense of being a good mother, a good wife get reshaped through this process. So I think in terms of these immigrants who become, let's go back to your talk about how people choose to be a lesbian rather than born as one. So like I think this is an interesting site for the further exploration for these topics like transnational movements of people, like how your sexuality gets to be chosen, and how eventually these women have to obey or sort of go back to like accommodate, like follow their traditional pressures back in their home countries and eventually get married. Interestingly, in the second episode of this of the documentary, there is actually one woman talking about like she's still very much in love with his female partner, but unfortunately she has to obey like her family's pressures or her father's ordinance, like she has to get married and have a child, which she doesn't really want to, but she has no choice about it. So yeah, just this is the thing I can come up with.
I'm so glad you asked about where to find images of more radical views of relationships of kinship. One reason that I brought up Against Equality twice is that that's an excellent resource if you're interested in those sorts of arguments. Not that we should need to look for affirming views. I hope that part of the criticism, part of the space for intellectual discourse is that we can formulate our own views. And on the same thread, I hope that we can also produce our own images, whether that's visual images or whether that's the possibility in a conversation to ask, well, what about non-US citizens? Well, what about people who do not have huge inheritances they're concerned about preserving? What about people who don't fit into these normative homonationalist models? I have been so heartened in the last month to see all of the critical discourse around marriage equality, and I've been especially heartened in the last 2 years to see an awareness entering into the public discourse of intersectionality. And I think that wide awareness of the importance of intersectionality allows people to bring up those sorts of critiques that say, not everyone fits a certain mold. What about the people who don't? So there are spaces, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on Tumblr, or whether you're creating it for yourself.
So should we open the floor, please, to thoughts, questions, responses to what you've heard already, or take us in another direction? We're eager to hear what you think.
I'm slightly apprehensive about one feels like one might be about to break some social norms, as I've only been in the US
Please
for a couple
do
of
that.
weeks. And I haven't at this point heard anybody make any dissenting comments in any of the sessions I've been to.
You're not going to, are you guys okay with it? Yeah, they're okay.
Okay. I absolutely, please don't apologise for being a political lesbian, from a political lesbian perspective. But nonetheless, I must admit, I'm really struck by the take on the marriage debate here that's so different from what's happening in Australia, I guess. And a number of those things are that the context is different, that the way in which the Australian legal system works is we have, I think, what's a much more rigorous, I think you guys have common law marriages.
In some states.
Some states. So we have a much more sort of rigorous framework of recognising de facto relationships. And so the marriage debate is actually, and we also have universal healthcare and free education and that sort of stuff, which means that these things which have been the focus of your conversation aren't part of our conversation. That so in my home state, we now have civil unions, and the difference between a civil union and a marriage is the date that the date on which is written on the forms. That if it's a marriage, the date is lodged as being the day of the ceremony, and if it's a civil union, it's the day the bureaucrat processes the paperwork. And this is the difference. And yet, there's still going to be there's still absolutely a fight on to go, no, we shouldn't be calling these things separate things. There should be a legal equality. So it's kind of interesting because in that context, I would very much describe my own social milieu as being, a lesbian feminist kind of milieu, in which I think many of my friends would have the same view that I hold, were actually, being quite uncomfortable with marriage as an institution and actually being slightly freaked out when friends who do get married go and refer to their partners as wife is something I can't quite deal with. But nonetheless, I think there would be almost universal support amongst my peer group for the marriage debates in Australia because it's seen as a notion of legal exception. It's that notion of not being treated differently. It's like, we don't necessarily want to do this, that's not what we would, but we don't want to be legally excluded from it. And that notion that it's a really important political principle, that it's part of kind of the broader cultural attitudes to queers. Generally, when you sit there and you kind of go, well, there's loads of people who aren't going to be affected by, so single people who aren't going to be affected by partners' rights, by having access to partners' estates or whatever. But the thing that does, have a big significant impact on their lives is the sort of the daily homophobia people have to deal with. And the idea that once you've got that state recognition of equality, that's actually, I think the whole thing about the Australian debate is it's about driving cultural change. That because marriage is in fact pretty much only a symbolic issue. Like, it really isn't practical issues at all dealt with. So it's really seen solely as a cultural change thing. So it's kind of, I don't know, anyway, it's interesting to watch the difference.
I imagine, Will, if you want to respond, but if anyone in the audience wants to chat too, we don't have to have it go back and forth. We're a small group, so please, anybody. I don't know that anyone feels hurt by what you said either.
I'm glad that you raised what, at least when I read into it, was a question of justifications, because that's really what fascinates me about all of these debates. How are we formulating our justifications and what's behind it? The justification that I heard at the end, which is very common in North America as well, is that marriage equality will end homophobia. Does anyone actually believe that? I haven't seen any studies to support that. In fact, rates of hate crimes have gone up in the last few years as marriage equality has gotten more awareness. Perhaps that's because people are just more aware. I'm not going to speculate about the causes, but I also would like to point to what is being vindicated in marriage equality. It's a certain kind of couplehood. So is that going to actually solve problems for people who do not conform to this perfect, beautiful, progressive lesbian model or other same-sex couple model? Is it going to help non-gender conforming individuals? Is it going to help those who do not fall into the mold of what is being supported by marriage equality? Or is it only going to protect, in a cultural sense, those who do conform?
I mean, sorry, is it okay for me to jump back into two comments. One is, does the law reform drive changes in attitudes? I would argue that it does, and the thing I'd point to, again coming out of the Australian context, was that we had a national apology to Australia's Indigenous people about 5 years ago. And the impact of that going from something that was contested and something that only radicals or political outsiders advocated to being something that was state-sanctioned, and the notion that every primary school in the country goes through and has their sort of apology day and all of that sort of stuff. That notion that something where it becomes the normative position, the normative position is to be accepting and you dissent from that, versus the other way around. I think that you could actually see a really visible difference. So it's like,
Can we have a national apology for homophobia and just dismiss the whole marriage rule?
Well, I kind of think that's sort of probably.
I think you want to enter the conversation.
I was also thinking about what you said, that it's a symbolic matter, but that's exactly the danger, that at some point becomes so fetishized with meanings that you don't have to discuss homophobia anymore because you discuss marriage all the time. For example, you discuss about hijab all the time and you never discuss about patriarchy because you fetishize, you focus all of your attention on this kind of, like it becomes a metonymy of the problem when in fact it discusses something completely different. You discuss a legal recognition of a specific relationship, or you discuss a specific kind of, I don't know, like some kind of cloth that is connected to a specific cultural history. But you don't discuss anything beyond that point. You stop at that point because you found a way to sublimate this antagonism, I used a lot of difficult words.
That is an excellent example.
Would you like to add?
Yeah, why not? So, not trying to sound pretentious, and I really don't want to come off that way. But I think also the other problem with, and I obviously don't know the Australian context, I'm not going to claim to know that because I do not. But in the American context from what I've seen, the other problem with the marriage debate, the equality debate, is it really lets people stay ignorant of the issues. It lets people say, I'm for marriage equality, so I'm not homophobic. Or I'm for marriage equality, so I'm in support of gay rights. Well, are you in support of gay rights? Or do you even know the extent or the depth of what gay rights are, or the history of what gay activism is? And that's when I really see the problem, especially from coming from my perspective as an undergraduate and seeing, and as an undergraduate in a school in New Hampshire with 97% white people in the town and in the college, it really kind of it hurts me to see the lack of knowledge that goes around having support for something. And I think that's really dangerous. And in another session, someone quoted Foucault in saying that not everything is bad, but everything is dangerous. And I think that's something to really kind of think about and digest. That there's a lot that I'm not trying to say people are bad people or something is a bad idea, but letting yourself be okay with half-heartedly knowing a subject is very, very dangerous, because it really helps people ignore the core of the issue, and it really deflects any systemic change, any really fundamental change from happening. And so I think that's where the danger lies. It's not for people who are really invested in change, it's for the people who get to slap a bumper sticker on their car and call it a day, or beat their horn. And that's my problem, is that kind of idea. I don't know if that sounded awful, but yeah.
In the back, yes.
I have a question for Joselyn, and
before we do that,
Sure.
do you want to respond to the marriage question
Well,
before
I mean,
we move on?
Wow, educator, like for that was amazing. That was I just wanted to say that the question of solidarity, I think, is a theme that's been since our keynote panel, and it's been running through a lot of the different panels. So I think these are fair questions, but yeah.
Okay, please. And I want to talk about political lesbianism, so let's not drop that, because that was in your question too, but you next, and then I'll...
Sure. So I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm a cis man at the only lesbian panel at this conference, and I'm about to ask a question partially about men, but I was curious if you had explored or given any thought to why the decision to convey the sort of homonationalist message that you talked about. The decision was made to use lesbians instead of gay men, and then in particular the kind of lesbians that were used in terms of sort of gender conforming or lipstick lesbians, or however you want to describe them, as opposed to gender non-conforming or butch or like different, more queer women, and how that sort of the decision to pick those pretty lesbians in terms of the threat they pose or don't pose, how that impacts the message that you're analyzing in the film.
This is for the either of the two of them,
Right.
I mean, I would say that I don't think that Angela Robinson decided that she wanted to go in and do some homonormative or homonationalist rhetorics, and I don't think that was a conscious decision. I think part of it stems from the core concept of the film, in that anytime you're going to kind of engage with an imagined state-sponsored agency, you're going to have to deal with questions of the nation-state. And whether or not the kind of transition from racialization, as I read, transition from like racialized criminality to kind of objectified whiteness, is, I don't deal with intent. This is how when I watch it over and over and over again, this is what I see. So
I didn't mean to imply that the intent was to convey the message, but how is the conveyance of the message or the interpretation of that message particular to the selection of those kinds of women or those kinds of lesbians, as opposed to if it were gay men, or as opposed to if it were differently expressing women?
I mean,
Well, wasn't it? I mean, she was producing it. I mean, she was making it in the context of the studio.
Right. I mean, so in some ways, when it comes to questions of why are they cisgendered, why are they kind of traditionally attractive, like they need to sell tickets. Jordana Brewster's a name.
I understand, there's.
You know, so there are certain expectations when it comes to how mainstream representations of female same-sex desire are conveyed, and it's not always about the lesbian audiences. You know,
It'd be cool to hear people in the room answer your question, but like in the affirmative. That's sort of what I was asking. Like, what would that look like? That crazy movie where those bodies actually didn't look like those women. Like, who would make that movie and where would I see it? And you know, what would its function be in our society? Like, why did that movie get made? Where the bodies you're imagining were the couple or the four? You know, where would we find them? How would we use it? What function would it have? Like, that to me is a really important question, but asked in the affirmative. Like, who's going to make that movie? And where will I get it? And how much will it cost? And, you know, I mean, I wonder if anyone wants to think about that too, as opposed to, well, you know, why does poor Angela Robinson end up having to have beautiful women playing?
And I think trying to make it even with men, even with like the most, you know, hetero-looking butch men would still be challenging enough. No, because it's still not. It still doesn't fit in with what straight people in the United States are comfortable consuming.
Yeah, what's the movie with the men?
No, I'm saying they're already out there in gay culture.
Are they performing this function, the homonationalizing function? I think that's what you're asking, right?
Yeah.
Do we know that movie?
What's the name?
I don't know. I'm asking you to imagine it. You know, does it exist? Can men play that role? I mean, that's I think what you're asking. Can they be cast out? The panel was about gendering these stories, and could they be gendered male? Could they be gendered homo male? Could they be gendered homo cis male? Are they? Are we watching them being played? Where are we watching that story be played? Or why is it on a woman's body? Why is it on that blonde body? Why does she have that hair every time? What gets done? What work gets done by that? I think you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you all to be making the movie I want to see, or you want to see.
One thing that sort of relates to this is I'm not a big popular cultural TV person, but it seems like that there are gay male couples that are being portrayed in mainstream TV. There's the Nearly Normal or something like that, and then there's the New Normal, and then there's another one that has a gay Modern Family. So those two, but there aren't, to my knowledge, lesbians sort of being, you know, portrayed in this new gay is normal kind of thing.
There's a couple on Grey's Anatomy, but I don't even want to talk about how problematic Grey's Anatomy is.
How about the real L word? And one article that I was thinking about including in my presentation was about one couple on the real L word. I don't know their names, but it was a similar story to the Jenna Wolf, that they're having a baby and they got married and it was this perfect, normal LA family.
It's about the class privilege of the real L word, the real L word.
So why your apology for using the word political lesbian? I just really was wondering what that meant, and then you're like, well, it's not that 70s kind. And so I also meant, I'm just curious to know what you were saying.
Question?
Oh, mine, or are you going to?
As yours. About that concept of political lesbian. I mean, essentially my comment is that I think that there just need to be more specifics, right, to what is being resuscitated from that concept. Actually, I first started thinking about this with Yu-Ying's point about, you know, financial success making it easier to gradually kind of make oneself known as lesbian to the family, right? And that's an old problem, but that it actually is one that the concept of political lesbian responded to, I think, in part in the 70s, in the sense that the concept of political lesbian, you know, emerges out of a feminist critique that says women shouldn't have to be dependent on men, right? And that one way to mark oneself as independent is to choose to be a lesbian, right? or to act like one in some way. I mean, like, you know, in some very prescribed way.
Like dress like one.
Right, dress like one, right. Like, it's very limited, it's very prescribed, it's got all kinds of problems. But the thing that's useful for me about looking at it would be that it's feminist. So, you know, absolutely one would need to ask a question about, you know, how do we use that concept in a way that's trans feminist, in a way that's, you know, anti-racist feminist, a bunch of different ways. But I think that the concept, as it originated, was explicitly feminist and was also pretty anti-capitalist, right? So it's not really a question, right? It would just be that if I was going to try to kind of name the utility of that term, it would be about those, being specific about the kind of historical or political genealogy, and maybe then using that as a way to put pressure on the slipperiness of homonationalism as a concept that can sometimes, I think, reinscribe a notion that like gay is wealthy, right, naturally somehow, or that kind of that doesn't talk about capitalist patriarchy as homophobia, essentially, in some kind of way, right, or that doesn't kind of name those things, right, like sort of the Suzanne Farr homophobia is one of those senses. Sometimes I think gets kind of almost overshadowed, right, when we sort of use the language of homonationalism to just say, like, yes, there's this one way to be gay, and it like sort of won so much, it's sort of become so powerful that it actually functions in ways that people used to just call homophobic, or used to just call capitalist, or used to just call sexist.
Excellent question, and I think yes, incorporating the historicity, incorporating everything that our modern understanding of what feminism is would bring to a definition is absolutely important. Look at what feminism was when the first political lesbians published on their work. That was a very different feminism than what we have today. It wasn't very intersectional. My
Wasn't not an
Yeah,
intersectional.
it was
That's
so
a kind of real false. It's like
yeah.
it's grown, and the conversation continues to flourish, and we learn from each other. But it wasn't not intersectional. At its very beginning, people were having those conversations, and I wasn't there. You may think I was, but I wasn't. I studied that because I was interested in 70s feminism as someone who had been told about it and had been cast out to my generation. So I was told 70s feminism, which is my mother's feminism, was essentialist, and so we weren't supposed to read it. And I went back and read it, and it wasn't essentialist, and it wasn't not intersectional. I think it's too quick to say we figured it all out now in the modern, and there was a sort of pre-modern feminism that, you know, doesn't, you know, okay, that's another binary that I'm really worried about. It's a through line of conversation, and many of us have been in the conversation for a long time, and we're learning from each other, we're talking to each other, it develops. So, you know, let's go back. Like, what is the bad political feminism? I mean, and I think I'm sounding confrontational. I don't want to be. I'm actually curious to know what that's standing in for you. Like, what do you
Sheila Jeffries. Not that you are Sheila Jeffries, just general geographical area. Julie Bindel. I think that these are the modern iterations of that feminism that have held over, that they're the consistent political feminists and are not trans-inclusive, are not class-aware. So certainly there were political lesbians who were intersectional as a movement, and as we see it in pop culture, it is not.
I see what you're saying. Okay, like that. Actually, that's really useful for me. Like, you know, but I think everybody, other.
You just came in for the Q&A. What do you
Do you want to say something?
No, I'm
You're listening.
I have a question for regarding the binaries. I'm curious about your language about how you talk about families. And so family regime is I guess, pre-modern versus only in comparison to the sort of like US imposition or acculturation of identity politics, sexual identity politics. And then, like, to be fair, we're talking about intersectional experiences all around. So I was just curious if that term itself, is that like from ethnographies? Is it a specific, discipline that uses that word? And if it sets up temporal binaries that I feel like your work is sort of working against in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm aware of the binary thinking that I'm sort of imposed again there, about this traditional versus modern, cultural versus civilization, family versus this modern gender topics. However, the way I'm using it, why I call it traditional is mostly like most of my informants think like this family pressures or this marriage expectations. For them, they think that's traditional kind of homophobic regimes, again, like as opposed to this modern, like they imagine this out and proud queer identities as a sign of modern, or things like they can represent themselves as a modernistic queer subjectivity. So like the informants themselves set these binaries in their imagination, like they're figuring out how they can mediate or sort out these conflicts. So this, I think that's very interesting thing, like these binaries sit in their own mindset, while in reality the family regimes is actually transforming very quickly, as I said, because of the impact of the feminism and the gay and lesbian movements, the expectations, the parents' attitude, the nurturing attitude toward children are very, very different from the past generations. But still, like in most of my informants' mind, they still regard family pressures as a traditional thing versus like this out queer identities as a modern thing. So yeah, that's probably my response to that. And that goes back, that reminds me of my comments about the political lesbianism. Like many of, I have encountered this question or this challenge many times, like how the practices of my informants, like they follow the family expectations, like they don't really challenge this family pressures by coming out. They just sort of sneaking around or insinuating the knowledge of the desire of their same-sex desires. And I'm just thinking, like they often get to be criticized that they are not political enough. Like they're.
I'm sorry, that's heartbreaking.
Right. So.
And I'm wondering if I understand why the word, like the identity category or just the category of lesbian, it would be incredibly useful. But I'm wondering if queer would be, if that would have a function at all, because that might help eschew sort of ideas of, visible recognition or, certain types of performances and all these, and I'm not sure. So I was just wondering if that was, even using these words to talk about Taiwanese sort of experiences might have political implications of themselves. So.
Actually, the language of queer is my own choice, because most of my approach, I purposely choose a group of informants who are not very politically active. Like they are not activists, they are just ordinary people living in their everyday life. So most of them are not aware of the term queer, they only know that they are lesbians, which is the most prevalent language that they can make sense of themselves, the desire of themselves. So I actually try to think of their practice as very, very clear in terms of how they can really challenge or subvert these heteronormative regimes without really like outright confrontation against it. So that's, yeah, as my last, the last part of my presentation, so I'm trying to figuring out like how I can see the resistant potential out of these appearing complicit practices, like how I can argue about it.
But maybe we can use that as an ending and sort of come back to where I started. We have about 10 more minutes, which is, you know, not just how those words function there, but how they function here, and how lesbian is only lesbian, and I look back, feminism is also only in this panel. And then the word lesbian feminism, which has been tossed around today, and the word political lesbian, which has been talked around today. And I'm wondering how these terms function for us in this room in relationship to the larger project of the conference, the words homonationalism and the word pinkwashing, because that does seem to me, maybe that is the important question to end with, and an unhappiness with these words are not useful in these conversations, or these identities, or these terms, or do they function for us in important ways as part of this conversation? I wonder what you all think in the lesbian panel about the valence of these words now, and in these particular conversations, the conversations that we're thinking about. And not just words, they're bodies and practices and politics. I mean, so if anyone wants to talk about that, I would be really curious. And I think it seems sort of scary, but
well, there are lots of ways to kind of tackle those questions from various perspectives, but in relation to my work, the use of the term lesbian is actually something that is kind of contentious for me. I frame the films that I look at as being a part of the kind of emerging genre of lesbian film, but I do that only because I want to recognize the connections between the narratives I'm exploring and others that exist that are gaining visibility, but none of the films that I look at use that term. None of the films deploy the use of lesbian by the characters themselves.
Or in the movies.
In the movies. There is one film where the sister tells the mother that she's a lesbian, but the character herself never uses the term. And I think part of that has to do with, well, for D.E.B.S, part of that has to do with trying to avoid the kind of politics associated with the history of the term lesbian. But I think also part of that has to do with the ways in which lesbian histories have been conceptualized traditionally in association with whiteness. And so what does that mean in relation to, I can see your face, you're having a really hard time. Well, okay, and
I just like, are you erasing the work of women of color?
No, not at all. And I recognize that there are women who accept the term lesbian of color, or women of color who accept the term lesbian. But when the monolithic lesbian community that does not exist is imagined.
By who?
Valid question.
By who? By us? We don't need to imagine it. We can talk together.
Okay, but part of what drew me to the work that I'm doing is the very limited literature that acknowledges the racism and whiteness of lesbian communities written by lesbians of color, but doesn't get explored further. And so I recognize what you're saying. For me, the choice is to describe the acts, the desires, and the behaviors, rather than use an identity that is not claimed by the people that I'm discussing.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I
I
understand.
mean, could it be that it's the rich, straight male consumers of the films that are defining that, wherein the use of the word lesbian is too threatening in terms of their rejection of their male sexuality, but the lesbian or same-sex relationships between two women is the only acceptable, fetishized, non-hetero relationship that's tolerable, that like you couldn't use men, you couldn't use trans, you couldn't use like the more queer-looking people in those films to convey the message. That's my initial reaction to that.
Yeah, to me, visually that looks like girl on girl.
Oh yeah.
Not femme lesbian, girl on girl.
Right.
Like that's also a different, it's not.
Well, and funnily enough, the way that the film is described on the back sounds exactly like that. I think I read it as recognizing that exists and trying to counter that.
Right.
But in many ways, the camp of D.E.B.S relies on what I would call the failures of dominant kind of popular culture texts to conceptualize the diversity of experience, of like visual presentation of women who may choose to be called lesbians or may choose to engage in female same-sex desires.
Community in a particular way because lesbians don't treat that as camp, right? I mean, that was your gesture to the lesbians.
No, I mean, it only works for people who know that history. There's a review from Roger Ebert who hated the film, and I mean, that's fine. I love the film.
Anyone else
So
are
very nice.
lesbians in the movement?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we don't have a lot of time, but I mean, I'm interested in this whole sort of pinkwashing homonationalism, that the word lesbian is not really used, despite the fact that there are, many people who appear to me as lesbians or, who identify as lesbians or, prominent in the movement. And it seems like, the queer, umbrella is part of the reason. I mean, which I identify myself as lesbian and queer, but I think a lot of people have the lesbian has slipped away and it's not.
So I think the question for me always, and maybe could all, is the eliding of the lesbian also an eliding of the feminism? And that when we say queer, do we always know that we're feminists? And I think that to me is the important question. I don't care what we call ourselves, and that can change and it needs to, it's dynamic.
Are you saying that all lesbians that are feminists though?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so does the word feminism, so we said, she said I'm a lesbian feminist, we were talking about political lesbianism, that, there's sort of add-ons that make sure that we understand that lesbianism is feminist. So no, all lesbians are feminists, so that's a good question. But I wonder, in the move to queer, do we lose that, through line? And it's a question, not an answer at all. But why isn't the word feminism showing up in any of the panels either? And again, I'm wondering if it's, you're pointing at a particular kind of feminism as not serving the movement, as if there aren't other feminisms. I mean, so like, yes, we cannot like that feminism, but what about all the rest of it? Is it useful? Of course it is. Is it showing up in another name?
Well, from an academic context, don't you think that saying queer also implies an intellectual legacy inclusive of the theorists who went before? So in that sense, perhaps it's irrelevant whether we say feminist political lesbian, for example, because included in that is this legacy.
We have a term we call an IKEA lesbian.
Is that like a Home Depot lesbian?
No, not exactly. So completely not political and really just kind of wanting to buy a nice house.
I was trying to think about, we didn't hear the word feminism, but I was trying to think about people I heard being cited in papers. I mean, there was Assab Nour, and there was Andrew Paul Grewal and Karen Kaplan, and there was Saba Mahmood, and there was Minin Moalam. There are a lot of people who do transnational feminism who I mean, Jasbir, I mean, it's just like there are people who bring feminism to the table. So I mean, it's definitely been here, but right, it's like, why are we not naming it? It's like, there's a kind of an assumption of a certain kind of...
But is that a washing?
It's, right.
That assumption, the other first assumption is washing. When you assume it and you don't say it, it's not said, it's washed away.
And the negative impact is, I think, perhaps just sort of what you said before was that, I mean, I felt like maybe you were playing into that, or not seeing it or not articulating it. No.
I guess I was washing by assuming that, presenting that.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not,
I don't know.
I'm not just saying.
I think we should end, but it was a great conversation. Thank you to the panelists. I think we're about to have keynotes, so I will invite Vera. Oh, one more panel.